So the recording is in progress. Great. Got it. We're good to go. So the title of my presentation is Nippon, the Journey of Japan's First Talking Film. Of course, my name is Wayne Arnold, and I'm with the University of Kitakyushu. And I have been working for 3 years with my co-researcher, Adrian Wood, who is silently in the background right now, but may appear later for the Q&A session. And we have been working for 3 years together on Nippon, which is Japan's first talking movie that was spread across Europe. And the point of my talk is to discuss how Nippon went from Berlin, where it was first shown in May 1932, to several other locations across Europe, with a special focus on Nippon in Paris. And as you can see here, this is an advertisement of Nippon in Paris. Just laser. Now, I'm going to begin with a picture of Henry Miller, because Henry Miller is my area of research, and that is what I've been researching for the last 10, 15 years. Specifically, I research Henry Miller and Japan. And 3 years ago, I gave a presentation through this same venue. And I will admit, I made some serious mistakes in my presentation. In particular, my section on Henry Miller and Paris, and the movies that Henry Miller watched, the Japanese movies that I believed that Henry Miller had watched in Paris during the 1930s. And as a result of the presentation, I started to get into communication, in particular with a person named Roger Macy. And I started to try and figure out what films Miller had seen in Paris concerning Japan. And as it turns out, my big mistake was, or one of my big mistakes during that section, was that Miller did not see many Japanese films in Paris. In fact, he probably only saw one Japanese film during the entirety of his stay, but not quite sure about that. By 1937, there would have been a few more, or at least one more Japanese film. So my research question became, well, first, once Roger Macy helped me figure out that Henry Miller had actually watched Nippon in Paris in 1932, 1933, my research question became, well, how was Henry Miller able to watch Nippon in Paris in 1932? Because there was some speculation that maybe Miller had actually gone over to Germany to watch Nippon, which was definitely, I knew would not be the case, because in 1932, Miller had $0 or zero francs, as it might be. So with a bit of searching and whatnot, it became pretty clear that Nippon had actually come over to Paris, and that was where Henry Miller was able to see the film. And so my research question again became, how was Henry Miller able to watch Nippon in Paris in that time period? And it has taken me 3 years, along with Adrian and I working together. It has taken 3 years to finally be able to come to a concrete answer of how Miller was able to watch the film. And so what I want to present today is actually nothing about Henry Miller. What I want to talk about today is Nippon and its journey across Europe during 1932, 1933, and then thereafter. And just for those who may not be familiar with the film, Nippon is a compilation of 3 silent Japanese dramas, 2 of which are sort of samurai, and one is modern day 1930s or even 1929 Japan. And these 3 silent films have joined together to create one film, which is about 80 minutes long. And 1932 is the time period where the talking films started to really become quite popular across Europe. And Nippon is basically those three silent films that were synchronized with Japanese dialogue soundtrack that was voiced in Berlin by what we might call local talent, probably international or international students or Japanese students living in Berlin. The idea of the film was to essentially expose Europeans to a more clear idea of Japanese culture. Whether it did that or not is up to debate. And it premiered in Berlin at the UFA Theater with a length of, like I said, around 30 minutes. So that's essentially Nippon in a nutshell. I'm going to go through a little bit more of the creation of Nippon as I go through this, but I will focus on a bit of other aspects. Now, a person that Adrian and I have spent a lot of time researching is a man named Nagamasa Kawakita. And the Kawakitas were, him and his wife Kashiko, they were a pretty big powerhouse of film distributors, even film production in Japan from essentially 1928, a little bit before, but 1928 all the way into the 1980s. Their company is still around today. Originally, it was called Towa Shoji. It's now Toho, Toho Towa, and they're still distributing films today in Japan. The Kawakita founded his company with in 1928 with the intention of importing German and French films into Japan in order to compete with the American films that were coming into Japan. He also wanted to export some of the Japanese films that were being made in Japan. And from 1928, even a little bit before, I think, during his study abroad, he visited Europe several times. And during one of his trips, along with his friend Baron von Stetenkron, he arranged for at least 3 silent films to be brought over to Europe. But again, it's 1929, 1930. Silent films are starting to become sound films are starting to become popular, talkie films. And so these silent films were quickly sort of outdated. And I'll get into that in a second here, but the Kawakitas were really trying to export these Japanese films to Europe to help create a better understanding of Japanese culture in Europe through the movies. Now, Adrian and I have published an article about this. I'm not going to talk anymore about Kawakita, but if you're interested in them and their trip to Berlin in 1932, Adrian and I have recently published an article called Kashiko Kawakita and the 1932 Towa Shoji Film Diary. This has lots of interesting photos and a pretty detailed extrapolation of this film diary that Kashiko wrote. Now, Nippon itself, the creation of Nippon, the editor or the producer and director, or excuse me, the director of the film is Carl Koch, and he was the husband of the famous silhouette film creator Lotte Reiniger. And Carl Koch was also very much not connected, but interested in Japanese culture. And so on the film, he is credited as the German editor and director. Baron Stetenkron was also the producer, and he was a close friend of the Kawakitas. Again, both of these men are talked about in detail in our article on the Kashiko's diary. Now, one of the interesting things, and it's lost to history, we'll probably never know. It was probably discussed verbally or through letters, which may now be, forever lost. It's unknown whether it was Koch's idea to inject this dialogue or dubbing into these silent films as Europe was becoming more talkie focused, or was it von Stetenkron, or perhaps even Kawakita himself that realized who realized that European markets would not be interested in silent Japanese films. And so somewhere probably between the three of them, the idea was hatched for Nippon. They were all friends with each other or acquainted with each other. And so the idea for Nippon took shape somewhere between the three of them, with Karl Koch being the German editor. One thing that we found during our research is that Kawakita was very interested in the talkie film. And in fact, in 1930, he wrote an article for the Kinema Junpo where he goes into great detail about the importance and significance of sound films in both the Japanese market and the European market. So certainly Kawakita wanted Japan to be producing talking films, and he was very likely looking for a situation where he could find somebody, likely in Europe, that could turn the silent films into talkie. And that's essentially what they succeeded in doing. Okay. So Nippon was completed in late 1931. Koch was working on this. We know this from letters between Lotte Reiniger and Breyer, which I'll mention a little bit later. And one of the things that Koch and Reiniger wanted for Nippon was that it would be released as an educational film. And you can see from the program over here, you've got, this is the release program in Berlin and those who are involved with the film. But it was not released as an educational film. And this was a bit disappointing for Koch, because if it had been released as an educational film, it would have received a much wider audience in Germany, and therefore it would have brought in more revenue. It was not this aspect of educational status was not granted. It was restricted to younger audiences, which was a bit of a disappointment for Koch and whatnot. But it did premiere in May 1st. During the premiere, in the gallery, or in the foyer of the theater, there was a small Japanese art and cultural exhibit. We don't know the details of that, but it definitely was there. And it was shown alongside of Lotte Reiniger's Harlequin, which the two would be paired together several times after that. And interestingly, about the time, the showing of that the Kawakitas were not actually present at the opening night, even though the Kawakitas were, or at least Nagamasa Kawakita was definitely involved in the creation of Berlin. They did watch the film later, I believe in August of 1932, when they finally arrived in Berlin. Now, I want to point out, and that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about as far as the creation of Nippon. And if you're interested in more, the two main sources on this are Iris Haukamp's book, and then Carl Serick's book as well. Both of them go into far more detail about Nippon. But what I want to focus for a few minutes here on the spread of Nippon across Europe during the 1930s, because it wasn't just in Berlin that it was shown, and it wasn't just in Paris. It had a large release across Europe, a fairly significant number of showings from the Netherlands, again in Berlin, and it was shown at Decamera. It moves over to Paris by November 18th. You've got Austria and several other locations where it is shown, Switzerland and things like that. Today, I'm going to focus on the Paris showing, but I do want to highlight real quick that after Nippon left the UFA Theater, it was shown at a smaller venue called Decamera. And it was shown alongside with Harlequin for some of the period there, but also, if you're interested more about that, we write a good bit about Decamera in our article covering the Towa Shoji film diary. Decamera in itself, the history there of that theater is quite interesting as well. But today I'm going to focus on this Paris showing of the gala premiere. Before I get to that, though, a couple other places that the screening of Nippon is important is at the theater of Urania. And here it's shown multiple times for not quite educational, but for university level classes. So it gets shown in 1932 to 33. It has 30 screenings across 2 different semesters. And as it goes into 34, 35, it's still being shown, not as often, but it's still getting some attention there. And this is, I think, pretty significant in the fact that the film was not just for the casual audience. It was actually being used, it was actually being studied as a good, presumably a good representation of an image of Japan, both the ancient, the middle, and the new periods of Japan. So I think that's a significant aspect of what's being shown there. We've contacted Urania for their archives, but unfortunately they don't have a whole lot more than what's available listed online. An interesting thing to point out, though, is that by 1934-35, it gets moved over to another screening, and the name, the name gets added to a little bit. They actually add part of the titles of the 3 films that make up Nippon there, with a slight typo on Samimaru. One thing to be cautious of if you delve into Nippon at all is that by 1935, there was another Japanese documentary that was produced by PCL. That was called Japan, not Nippon, but Japan. And it was considered culturally valuable, and actually was allowed to be screened for adolescents and minors and whatnot. So things get a little bit confusing as far as the title of the film when this new documentary appears. But as I will show towards the end of today's lecture, I'll show that there were many titles actually for Nippon. And then real quickly, in 1933, it goes on to other areas as well, and gets shown at these different places in various locations. So it wasn't just in 1992, or 1932, but 1933 as well. So now I'm going to shift over to Nippon and the gala premiere in Paris. And this has been a large chunk of our research. It has a lot to do with my main research question, which was how Henry Miller was able to see the film. And I want to focus on tonight, or in this presentation, I want to focus on how the movie shifted over to Paris and then how it was received, or excuse me, how it was presented in Paris. So the news that Nippon was shown in Berlin was quickly announced in France. One of the quotes was, "A Japanese film entirely spoken and performed by Japanese artists has just been successfully screened in a Berlin cinema." And it talks about how this is about the rising sun and pre-samurai days, to the present day. One of the things that we know through archive research, letters between Lotte Reiniger and Breyer, who was the editor of the famous film magazine Close Up. In one of her letters, Reiniger tells Breyer that the French had ordered 20 copies of the film. Unfortunately, doesn't give a whole lot more detail about who or where or when and whatnot. But we know that the film was of interest to the French, and this would have been excellent news for Koch and Reiniger, because at that time they were in very desperate situation financially, even being supported by Breyer at certain times. So by the fall of 1932, the French film magazines are starting to talk about Nippon, and that France and Paris will soon get its first Japanese talkie. So I want to first, so the journey over to Paris involved obviously a distributor, and in this case, it was a brand new organization in Paris. It was called Leo Films, and this is sort of where one of those things about research becomes sort of complicated. When you need to either make a left or you need to make a right in your research, and sometimes you make the wrong turn. Leo Cohen is a man from, well, let me first start. In the summer of 1932 in Paris, there was a company, a distribution company founded called Leo Films. And this Leo Films was established to distribute specifically French films throughout Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and to other locations. It was founded in part with a man named Leo Cohen, who was originally from Smyrna in around 1920 or so, moved to Alexandria, Egypt, and spent maybe 1921. It spent about 10 years there distributing French films. And then in 1932, he moved to Paris and set up Leo Films. I have in there, eventually he moved to New York and Vineland. Cohen was a Sephardic Jew. And so in 1939, when the Nazis were rapidly approaching to Paris, Cohen went to the United States in order to try and establish a film company or a film distribution company there. He even moved for a short period to Vineland, New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey, and just last week, I went and looked at two of the houses that Leo Cohen lived in Vineland, New Jersey, just because I've researched this guy so extensively. I wanted to actually go and see his where he lived. Cohen had a lot of connections in Egypt. He was with the company Politi at Cohen. The Politi Frères was related to him, and the Maurice Arditi family. These were all connected through, essentially through marriages and things like that. So a very large extended family. Now, the problem that comes in for our research is that In the summer of 1932, there were 2 Leo films that were established in Paris, and within months of each other. And the second, or the first, depending on what you want to consider, was the Société Française Leo Films. And this was the Leo Films that was based out of Munich, Germany. And they were a Catholic organization. And about 2 years ago, Adrian and I had to make a decision, in a sense. Was it the Leo Films that was by Leo Cohen, or was it the Leo Films out of Munich, the Leo Films AG? And we chose the Leo Films AG. And we went into that because at that time, we had zero real connection of which Leo films had Nippon. That's sort of the connection there. I think, well, yeah. So here, there's Nippon has this Leo films there, and so we went and pursued the wrong or incorrect Leo films. It was quite a journey. Lasted about 9 months of extensive research. It did result in an article, which was published in the Historical Journal of Film, Radio, and Television. It was gripping to research this. I mean, you had the Nazis, you had the Catholics, you had the spy elements, you had them trying to go into Paris and France and establish a company, and within all of that, we could find no connection to Nippon. But it was still there, and it was still quite enticing. So that is one of the articles sort of that came out of our research, not at all connected to the main research question, as it turns out. We had actually gone through the entire process of doing the research, writing the article, and then finding out through a stroke of luck or bad luck that Nippon was not Leo Films AG. So now, with the correct Leo Films in sight, our research has forged ahead into Leo Films and Leo Cohen. So Leo Cohen secures Nippon for Paris, and he had been distributing French films for more than a decade. And he had several connections in Paris, and in particular with the film magazine La Critique Cinématographique. He also had the French and Egypt business partners, as well as family connections. So he had quite a network that had been built up. And so when he secured Nippon for distribution and the grand display in Paris in November, he set about creating quite an elaborate production. And so what I want to focus on now, as I go through the rest of this discussion, is to look at what happened at the Grand Gala of Nippon in Paris. And basically, we're going to go what we did was we went through all of the names that were associated with the Nippon advertisements, starting literally with the advertiser. By mid-November, there were advertisements in France that a Japanese talking film was going to becoming to Paris. There were numerous magazine adverts and things like that promoting the Grand Gala. The main advertisement that was done for Leo Films and Nippon was done by a advertisement studio called Diam, which was directed by Roger Hamid. And if you look here, his name Diam, so that's probably where the Diam comes in. It's just reversing some of his letters of his name. He was, in 1932, it's kind of interesting. Diam Studio was, I wouldn't say everywhere, but it had some very large clients, including Jacques Haig, who, just for anybody who might recognize the name or be interested, at that time in 1932, the advertising manager was Maurice Bessy, who went on to write several important books about French cinema in later decades. They were also doing advertisements for Nero Film, including Pabst's L'Atlantide, which is this advertisement down at the bottom. Nero Film, of course, was directed by Seymour Nebenzahl, who was closely connected with the with Nippon in Berlin. So anyway, Diam Studio is the does several of the or at least this main advertisement for Nippon. You can see their name down here, and it was from here that we started to get some of the names that were associated with Nippon. And so this is one of the just a French newspaper advertisement or blurb, I should say, about Nippon. And in it, it lists a lot of important names. You've got the Folie Dramatique, you've got the ambassador of Japan is coming there, you've got Colonel Pico, who's going to be there, you've got Claude Farrar. And so essentially, and then you have this dancer down here, you have this Japanese dancer of Yoichi Nimura. They've misspelled his name there, which was pretty common, and whatnot. And so we went through and sort of extrapolated and tried to figure out how these people were involved with the main release of Nippon in Paris. And we're going to start with Yoichi Nimura, and he's quite an interesting. And his wife are quite interesting people. Nimura was married to Lee Son-kei, who was also a dancer. And essentially what had happened was in 1932, Lee Son-kei and Nimura went over to England to take part in a summer dance school. They went over with their manager, who was named Virginia Lee, and they went over and spent some time in England during the summer. And then they decided, as a sort of a whim, they had returned tickets to the United States, but they decided on a whim that they would go over to Europe and try their luck. And that's essentially what they did. And they wound up having quite a lot of success in Europe. And the first event that Nimura was able to secure for a dance was the grand release of Nippon. And so he, during the November 18th screening, he does a solo dance during the event, or excuse me, previous to the film being shown. And in order to advertise this event, or Nimura's dance, they were actually larger than life-size replicas of him that were attached to automobiles around Paris, advertising his dance. So it wasn't just that they were showing the first Japanese talkie, but they actually had a Japanese dancer that was going to be at the opening of of Nippon. So pretty important there. So he's a big draw for people and whatnot. Now he does this dance. We don't actually know what the dance was called, but in the archive materials for Nimura, which are at the New York Public Library, and then Lee Son-kei's materials, which are at Carnegie Hall, unfortunately, there's no reference to Nippon. So either it was just one of those things that, well, no known reference. Let's just put it that way. Of course, there could be more, but just in the last couple of days, I've been in contact with Carnegie Hall, and they have a large online digital collection of Lee Son-kei's photographs of Nimura and Kei as they traveled through Europe and then spent time at Carnegie Hall. And my impression of Nimura has greatly increased. I mean, they were literally living in Carnegie Hall at their studio up until I think it was 1950, 55, 56. So quite important dancers during their period of both dancing and instruction at later points in time. Another person that was present at the opening was the Japanese ambassador to France, Harukazu Nagaoka. Again, another sort of interesting person to have there. He was only the ambassador in France for a very short period of time, a little bit over a year, due in part to increasing conflicts between, sort of Japanese politics and European politics. Kind of led to his short tenure as ambassador to France. But he was one of the distinguished patrons at the opening for Nippon. And one of the interesting things about him, and this is pure speculation, I don't have any real proof to this, but he had been an ambassador in Germany. And he had, during that time, and because of his obviously being Japanese, he had become friends with Dr. Wilhelm Solf, who was the German ambassador, the first German ambassador to Japan after World War I. And Dr. Zolf was highly respected in Japan, very much loved, but he was also friends with Nagamasa Kawakita through their film distribution efforts. And in 1930, I believe it was, there was a party in Berlin where that Nagaoka had, and he, at that party was Dr. Zolf. And so there is a clear connection between Nagaoka and Zolf and Kawakita. And then to top it all off, you have Lagi Zolf, who was Dr. Zolf's daughter, who it's presumed that she had a very big part in the creation of Nippon. And Iris Haukamp's book goes into a lot more detail about that, if you're curious about that. But it is kind of this interesting connection between, okay, and there may be nothing, about it. It is Japan's first talkie coming to Paris. It's a big event. So, of course, you're going to invite the ambassador to Paris, who's Japanese, right? It's not really rare, but at the same time, there are these small world connections between various ambassadors. Now, and this is the part of the presentation where I might step on some toes. The history of Nippon and the history of Nippon in France has been diverted, to put it lightly, by a crucial typo. And in 2001, there was a showing of Nippon in Italy for the film festival. And Marion Lewinsky, who often goes by MLF in terms of her descriptions of Nippon, wrote, so Nippon was shown there, two parts of Nippon was shown there in 2001. And in the text for the description of the movie, in particular the French version of the film, MLF mistypes the name of the man who created the French intertitles for Nippon. And to quote, she says, in Claude Farrer's, I'm not actually sure it's actually not a real family name, French version of Nippon, the second section of Karabi is missing. Unfortunately, that is a very serious typo. It's serious, as I'll show, because it has repercussions. This happened in 2001. Unfortunately, Lewinsky mistypes the name of a famous French novelist named Claude Farrère, who was a decorated war hero, a famous novelist. He was a Japanist and loved the theater. He was good friends with Pierre Loti, and he had written several famous novels about the dealing with Japan and whatnot. And so his name gets misspelled in this description of Nippon in 2001. And you can kind of see here, this is Claude Farrère kind of gazing off into the distance of the future and sort of wondering how his name got misspelled, and that he was essentially erased from all contemporary research on Nippon relating to Nippon and Paris. The typo, if you type in the incorrect spelling of Claude Farrère's name, if you type that into Google, you will get linked to numerous websites that talk or mention about Nippon, and they have, all of them have used the wrong name. And so Claude Farrère, an incredibly famous French author, and I would argue, and Adrian might argue against me on this, he is the most famous person associated with the film in any country, in the German version or the French version. Claude Farrère in 1932 was the most famous person connected with Nippon. But unfortunately, due to this typo that has propagated throughout the literature and the websites concerning the French version of Nippon, these have completely eradicated Claude Farrère from Nippon. It's kind of shocking. In fact, in all of our research over the last 3 years, only once in a book review did someone catch that the name has been mistyped. So the consequence, it appears in Haukamp's version, it appears in Sarek's version of, or a book on Ufa, other places it appears where it's just the typo has unfortunately continued. And so this now is Claude Farrère looking at us in 2024 and saying, please do not continue this typo. And so we're going to bring him back into the discussion because he was pretty significant. He had connections with the Colonel Pico through their war efforts, and Colonel Pico was the one of the guests at Nippon. You can see here another advertisement here where the Grand Gala. You've got Colonel Pico there. You've got Claude Farrère here. And these two men were connected through their war efforts, World War I. Colonel Pico is also an interesting person. He created the La Guerre Cassée, excuse my French, it's been erased by Japanese, and which basically means the broken faces of World War I. From World War I, and he and Farrère were connected through military groups. In particular, something that quite interesting happened in May 1932 when the premiere was happening of Nippon was happening in Berlin. Not connected at all, but there was an assassination of Paul Doumet in May 1932. Both Farrère was standing right next to Doumet when he was shot and eventually died hours later. Farrère wrestled the gun from the assailant and sort of saved the day. He was also shot in his arm, Farrère was. And then at the funeral that took place, Picot, who is here, and his group also paid tribute to Doumet during that. So they were connected that way. it was not terribly uncommon for Picot to become an honorary guest for these as a money-raising event. For example, in 1936, the Hakim brothers, who had been originally associated with Asso Films, the Hakim brothers held a gala where Picot was also one of the guests at the film gala. So he's there at the opening of Nippon in 1932. And then we get into the Folies Dramatique, and this is where the film is actually shown. This is where everybody comes together to watch the film. It was an old movie theater that had been converted at the end of the 1920s, had been converted into a movie theater. It was managed by a man named Alexis Dalmadico, who was from Beirut. And the theater was known for showing, avant-garde films as well as mainstream films. It had shown the German naturist, sort of one of the first nudist films, La Marche au Soleil, which, by the way, Henry Miller also saw when it was showing there. Dalmadico is connected to Leo Cohen and Leo Films through family, so it's not surprising that Folies Dramatiques would show Nippon through that connection. But the film did not make money for Dalmadico, and he lamented in 33 that the Nippon was actually a money loser for him. And so there was, while the reception was great in Paris and France in general, it was not overwhelming. Now I want to get into, so those are the kind of the characters involved with Nippon and the Grand Gala. I want to get into, before I wrap up here, I want to get into a little bit about some of the revisions of Nippon. And as it went across Europe, interestingly, the title changed. It was originally released in Berlin with the censor card as Nippon, Japan reflected in its films. Then it gets to the premiere, which the program card I showed on a previous slide. There it's Nippon, Human Destinies in Japan. When it gets to the general release, it becomes basically Life and Love in Japan. And then when over in Austria, it comes back to, when it's shown at Urania, it goes back to the original censor card. By the time it gets to the Netherlands, again, the title has changed, Three Adventures in Old and Modern Japan. The French Gala, interestingly enough, it has, to our knowledge, it has no subtitle, so it's just Nippon. And then by the time the post Gala, it picks up as three images of the life in Japan. By 1934, and I have a question mark here because we think it's 1934, under the release of Quorum Film, it becomes Liebe und Leidenschaft in Japan. And importantly, there is actually no use of the word Nippon in the title. And this is the film that I believe most of the contemporary research on Nippon is based off of. And so you have the 1931, you have this film still here of from what we think is the 1934 version, and then an updated slide or a still in the movie for the modern section that says 1934. So we assume there, but interestingly enough, there is no use of the word Nippon in the title of that version of the film. And not long after I gave my original presentation on Henry Miller in Japan here 3 years ago, I was able to secure a copy a partial copy of that film. 1931, this slide is in the original section of the three Carl Koch, Claude Frere versions. Often Claude Frere is credited as the editor or even director sometimes of the Nippon French version. And then, as I mentioned, the 1934 version which is distributed by or released by Coram Films. There are other revisions that go on after this in kind of interestingly, sort of a mystery here. In 1948 and 1950, there were apparently two showings at the Cinématique Français. And this is something that we found in some dissertation notes, but that we have not been able to reconfirm. So that's kind of an interesting mystery. There are other places that it gets shown. And in particular here in 1963, it gets shown again in Paris with the presence of Kashiko Kawakita, Nagamasa's wife. She had by that time become an extremely important and influential and famous Japanese film distributor from Japan. And over here, I have a couple of the slides here that show that still even Leo Films is present there. It changes to 2 images of life in Japan, meaning that one of the sections was removed at a certain point and whatnot. And so we've kind of been researching about that. And so that is my research of with Adrian Wood, our research of Nippon. And when I gave this presentation about Henry Miller in Japan 3 years ago, I would never have imagined that I would know so much about European film in 1932. And I've joked a few times that it has almost been like getting another PhD, like the extensive amount of research and studying that the two of us have done over this time period have been, it's been shocking. It's a shocking amount. My wife has complained about it, that I talk about Nippon more than her. One time she even said that you haven't mentioned Henry Miller's name in a long time as well, and whatnot. So to bring this full circle before I hit 8 o'clock or so, or the 1 hour mark, I do want to tie this back into Henry Miller and my research and why I not jumped shipped, but shifted so dramatically away from my research on Henry Miller in Japan into this film, Nippon, and how Henry Miller was able to see it in Paris in 1932. In 1933, on October 17th, and this should have been a warning to me. October 17th is my birthday. This should have been a warning. Should have been like some site like, okay, I need to be careful of whatever's in this letter that Henry Miller wrote decades before I was even born, even before my parents were born. Should have been a clue. He comes back from having seen Madame Butterfly, which obviously, is the famous Cary Grant Hollywood Paramount film. He comes back and he writes a letter to Anais Nin, and he tells her that he's just gone to see Madame Butterfly and that he was thrilled, more than that, deeply moved. And then he says this: having seen the celebrated films by the Japanese players some time ago, ancient, medieval, and modern Japan, I had some basis of comparison whereby to judge her interpretation. He doesn't say Nippon. He mentions ancient, medieval, and modern, which is why, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, I thought that Miller had seen multiple Japanese films in Paris. Instead, he had only seen one that was composed of multiple films. as I now know, 3 years later. And then again, he mentions in 1936 in his essay called The Golden Age, which is an essay about cinema. He says, I have been going to the cinema regularly for almost 40 years. In that time, I have seen several thousand films. It should be understood, therefore, that I am not unmindful of having seen such remarkable films. And then he goes through and he gives a list of, I'm going to guess, about 100 films. And in there, he includes this: 3 Japanese films, ancient, medieval, and modern Japan, the title of which I have forgotten. Now, for Henry Miller to forget the title of a film, it's pretty rare, but this is one of those things that has occurred a couple times in relation to Nippon, is that the people who talk about it have forgotten the name, which is kind of interesting. So there are 2 references to Nippon in Henry Miller's work, that he indirectly references the film, but obviously has had a significant impact, enough so that he praises Madame Butterfly, and we don't even need to go into the fact that, you know, Sylvia Sidney is not Japanese, but he goes into that Madame Butterfly praises it based on Nippon. Later, when he lists several films, he includes Nippon in there. So I would like to give a big shout out to the Modern Japan History Workshop, going all the way back to 2021 when I presented on Miller in Japan. Since that presentation, Adrian and I have been pretty busy. We have made 3, and if you want to count this one, 4 presentations related to Nippon. We received in 2020, we received some funding from my university, which greatly helped some of our research trips, to go to Tokyo, actually to see the Kawakita Historical Society, and meet with the people there, which we are very grateful of their willingness to participate in our endeavors. And we have published 2 articles, one about the incorrect Leo film, but still a fascinating area of research. Pretty much the first English article that we're aware of about Leo film AG. We recently published, well, I guess now it's not quite, well, yeah, it was December 2023, the Kashiko Kawakita in the 1932 Towa Shoji Film Diary, and our forthcoming article on Nippon and Paris. And so it has been a crazy 3 years that I would not have expected. And I'm going to end now because we're about at 8 o'clock. And I am really hopeful. I do want all of your questions, but I sure hope that you're not going to change the next 3 years of my life. And with that being said, I will open the floor up to questions, which I think you can just start asking right away. I don't think we need any transition there. So please ask some questions.
I think Iris has a question. Or no, that's a clap, sorry.
I see that Roger Macy is here. Thank you, Roger, that for your emails. Also quite enlightening. Adrian's back. Okay, let's see now. Claire, let's see, I've got your raised hand, so you can either talk or is there a chat? Yes, okay, here's the chat.
Hello, thank you very much for this. Do you hear me?
Yep, everything's good.
Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. I'm actually on a book project about the reception of Japanese cinema in France before the 1950s. So I was also working on the reception of Nippon in France, and I see that you have already wrapped up, done almost the work. So I'm very grateful about your work, and I'm going to. I'm looking forward to reading your papers, and so I have the possibility. Since I'm working in Geneva, I have very easily the possibility to go to France and to check in the France archives. So if you need something, you just don't hesitate to ask me. And I have just one question about Nippon. Do you know that Nippon was granted Diploma d'Onore in the festival, the Mostra in Venice in 1934? And it is the very first Japanese movie who was granted an international prize, film prize in Venice.
Adrian, you can back me up on this, but I believe we did come across that information. Is that correct?
Yeah, we explored that.
Yeah.
And
my question was, what do you have any idea of the version of Nippon who was screened in Venice in 1934?
From what we understand, and collaborating with researchers who specialize in Italian cinema, it seems that the Nippon that received the Mostra was not this Nippon. It was a different Nippon of the same name. But I'd be happy to share our documentation that supports the view we've taken.
Okay.
And having guided Wayne to do the left and the right on Leo film, I'm rather more cautious nowadays, so we don't go down the wrong avenues. But I believe the Nippon in Venice was a different film.
Okay.
But I would be happily corrected.
Okay, I have the project to go to Venice and to check in the Mostra archives, so we could get in touch and partake
we have
the results.
We had documentation from the Mostra archives.
Okay.
So, but again, with the simplistic nature of its basic title, Nippon, it leads to confusion.
Okay.
But it's a dialogue that we can continue, I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just to chime in, I mentioned that in 1935 there was in Austria there was another showing of a Japan documentary, and I believe in the back of my mind that originally that Japan documentary was actually Nippon, but it was a documentary, not this version of the film that we've been talking about today. But again, yeah, it's easy to get this confused, and it would be good if you could, also check that. Yeah. Not to poo-poo the Carl Koch Nippon, but yeah, I'm not sure it's prize worthy, but some it's a matter of opinion.
On a technical level, I'd slightly say it was, because of what it aspired to do, and Koch's skillful editing, so that because the actors or the students that voiced the film were not lip sync artists. And so in the manner in which Koch edited, you see the first syllable in the close-up of the lips of the actor, and then it cuts to a reverse shot, so you're seeing the back of the actor's head, and the student is then speaking words that gives the narrative that they wish to convey, or sense of narrative they wish to convey. So I mean, technically, I think it might have won a prize, but as an artistic work, I totally with Wayne on that one. And
Yeah,
Roger, you're nodding, and I have to say it was your posting on Kine Japan that brought Wayne and I together.
yeah, without a
And
doubt.
and so we owe you a great deal.
I don't know who's next. I've got Roger and Iris are got their
I think
hands up.
Iris is first.
Iris is first. Okay.
Hi, and thank you. And Roger, it's very nice to see you after all those years. I hope you've been well. Wayne, Adrian, thank you very much. I'm super delighted that research into those kind of weird old film projects continue. And when I worked on this film, it was more a bit of a background in German-Japanese film relations. But it's difficult to get away from it, right? Because it's so fascinating. So I'm really happy, and I get lost in those details as well. So it's really interesting. So I've got one question and one comment. And my question would be, so one of the things that always struck me with the version I worked with, which might well be the 1934 version, was that they created dialogue for the film, right, in Japanese in Berlin, where it then was dubbed, and then it got subtitled in German, right? And I've always wondered, because sometimes the text actually doesn't, the translation don't really fit, right? What's being said in Japanese. And I've always wondered about it. It just seems weird to me that they did that. And I'm not sure if you've looked into this, but do you know anything about who actually translated the subtitles for the French version?
Okay, well, so maybe I didn't make that clear in the in my presentation, but it was Claude Farrar. He translated the film from German into French. And that's how he gets connected with the film. He is the translator, and in multiple news articles from that period, he is credited as the translator, and then therefore sometimes credited as the not director, but well, maybe director or producer of the French version of Nippon.
Okay, and talking
Iris,
about, oh, sorry, Edwin. Yeah.
sorry just to clarify, when you talk about the version you saw, did you see the French version at the Cinémathèque Française, or did you see the Swiss German at the Cinémathèque Suisse? Which one were you basing your research on?
So I watched the one with the German subtitles. So from the Cinémathèque Suisse, I guess.
Suisse.
I never
Yeah. Okay.
I never watched the French one.
Right. Okay. So and there is the difference, because we can, I think, assume that Koch and Solf, perhaps Laggy Solf, maybe were, but certainly Koch was responsible for the text on the German intertitles. But the words spoken by the students, I'm not a Japanese linguist, but from what I understand, the Japanese doesn't wholly mirror what's in those intertitles, and I think most audience members would not have been Japanese linguists. So I think it was enough for the filmmakers that they were hearing Japanese, but reading a narrative driven by intertitles in a very traditional way.
Mhm.
I don't know. Would you agree with that, Wayne?
Yeah, I'm not gonna go against your memory, as it's much better than mine, but I would agree overall with what you.
Yeah. Now, when Ferrer came to create a narrative for the French version, we can imagine as he relied on the German in the same way, or he may have totally changed it. The complication of the film is it exists in two forms, and it's the intriguing thing that the Swiss German has a slightly truncated version of films 1 and 2 and some of film 3, whereas the French only has films 1 and 3 as it survives today. So we've got no idea what could have happened in the French film 2, only what happened in film 1 and film 3. And so you could do a translation comparison between the French and German for part 1, the French and German for part 3, but you've only got the German for part 2. What we do know from the censor records from the Netherlands is what the dialogue was for the Dutch version. And that seems to be a direct translation of the German. So I'm sorry, that's not a simplistic answer to that question. But
Totally.
saying that,
yeah.
maybe you'd like to move on to your comment.
Okay, I mean, nothing with this film is simplistic, which is why it's so much fun. Now, of course, and thank you for bringing back Ferrer, who makes so much more sense. But of course, this bugs me. So if I ever revise my book, Ferrer will come back in. And I can send you this if you want to, because I just a tiny little bit, just looked up people, but then never really followed it. But I found this very obscure Romanian publication in the 1930s where Loti and Ferrer, so the way it's written in the Bologna thing, I actually mentioned in the same sentence. And I remember being like, yeah, Ferrer is fine. So the mistake actually goes back far further than the 2001. And I can look for it and I can send it to you if you want to.
I would love to see that. Yeah, definitely.
But I mean, it's interesting that Marianne's notes in 2001 would have relied on a Romanian publication from the 1930s, but I mean, it's great if that's where it originates from.
Or it just could be
I have no idea, because
a fairly common typo.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I can't read. I couldn't read. I can't read Romanian, but I was like, yeah, Loti Ferrer somehow makes sense.
Interesting.
So,
yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
I'll find it. I'll send it to you.
Yeah,
we would like to. We'd like to have that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
No,
thank you.
thank you.
And Roger?
Hi, yeah. Well, thanks very much. I mean, I loved all the detail. I mean, I love research and papers that really, get into the detail like that. Very much so. So, but what? Oh, yeah. Well, one Neil. First of all, as a Limey, suppose you went from Tokyo to Seoul today, you would not say you were going to Asia. And I'm quite sure Kawakita, if he were going from Seoul to Keijo in 1932, would not have said, I'm going to Asia. So I sort of I reacted against some, you said somebody went from London to Paris and they were going to Europe. That's a much more political comment than you obviously realize. So beware on that one.
Excuse my American ignorance.
Yeah. Okay.
Roger, forgive me, but I spent 3 years trying to educate him about geography. It's got nowhere, but I forgive him.
Okay, right, good. So that's out of the way. Then, okay, Japan's first talkie. Now, just let's unwrap that a little bit. I mean, obviously, film promoters, I mean, then, first cousins to circus promoters, they're obviously going to push their film any way they can. But do we need surely to be a bit more critical about that comment, because you then use it as a substantive without question. I mean, for example, let's look at it the other way round. Charlie Chaplin, the tramp, never spoke. Well, yes, he did. He did very much in Japan because all the benches voiced him. And so you would have to say that the Gold Rush was America's first talkie. I mean, if you were going to do it that way. So I definitely put a big question mark about Nippon being a talkie anyway, or Japan's talkie. It was Koch's talkie on Japanese material. Yeah. Then there's the whole question about to what extent it was a success in terms of producing Japanese culture. I mean, if you look around this period, there are in every country, there are one or two people who have, because hardly anyone knows anything about Japan, that there are, if you do know a bit, then you have become the ambassador for Japan, and you could name people in Russia and so on who have this, and so Farrar. No, there's another name I would have picked out in Paris as well, but I haven't have to look back on my notes. But anyway, yes, you can, if you know, but in these days, become the interpreter for Japanese culture. But is this? I mean, it didn't. I would argue more broadly that there are multiple failures in trying to introduce Japanese culture. They had some success, but they did not take off for reasons, which is why a lot of us are interested. Anyway, that's my points. Thank you.
Right. Well, let me jump in there on what you're saying as far as the success of Nippon, and it ties to Jack's question about what was the critical response to that, and actually in 2022, Adrian and I gave a presentation called "An Image of Japan: European Media Evaluation of Japan in Film Reviews of Nippon," and to kind of go with your question there, like or your point there, was Nippon a success? I would say we went through, and when we were reading all of the different reviews from in French and German and Swiss and all over the different places, we were kind of giving them a positive review or a negative review or a medium, middle of the road review. And I would say that a larger percentage were positive about Nippon as this, maybe the showing of or visual image of Japanese culture as portrayed in these films. But I think the result of Nippon was positive. Now, to go a little bit back, Roger, to your comment, what as a talkie, I was kind of wondering if you were going to mention the fact that it was a dubbed film, right? So would it even be? I guess it would still be considered a talkie because dubbing was so becoming pretty popular around 1932. But overall, I think the critical reception of the movie was positive. Obviously, Henry Miller really liked it and remembered it, even though he couldn't remember the name. Yeah, so that's kind of some definitely some interesting points there of what Koch did, and then his dubbing efforts for the film. Adrian, do you have? Oh, go ahead, Roger.
I just say in relation to what Adrian was saying, that I mean, Nippon could, in theoretical terms, be a perfect artistic success without really having any Japanese authorial content or success in representing Japanese culture as Japanese know it. It could still be an artistic success.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back a little, the film is undeniably a sound film, and so I think the use of the word talkie can be misinterpreted even in the 30s. I think it was a way of marketing a sound film and making it clear that it was a talkie. And in my response to Iris a short while ago, I suspect the vast majority of the audiences in wherever they saw it in Europe couldn't understand the dialogue anyway. There may have been a few who had linguistic ability, who understood it, but we didn't encounter any criticism of the conflict between the narrative driven by the intertitles compared to the narrative as presented in the soundtrack. So I maybe one thing we need to do is actually transcribe and translate the soundtrack at a point in the future when and then do a comparison and analysis of that and see how it compares. But I think it is a talkie, but it's a sound film. A talkie is a word that was used in the marketing, so I'm not uncomfortable with it, even though it's fabricated talkie, as it were.
I was actually more interested in the Japan's. If you put the substantive Japan's first talkie, you would understand that this was something the Japanese had made. You know, yeah.
It is one of the confusions is that if you look at the opening titles, the original opening titles that are in, some of which are still in the Swiss version or Swiss German version and are in the censor record, it's clear it's made by Toa Shoji Berlin. There's no attempt to mislead. And it even references the involvement of productions from Shochiku that were used to create this Toa Shoji Berlin production. And so I think there was transparency on the part of Koch and von Stetenkron. How then in the French version that survives, which is clearly noted as being a two-part, and the font and the text style in that two-part is completely different to the titles that survive from the three-part. There's no mention of Toa Shoji. That seems to be more of an obfuscation of the truth of the origins of the film, whereas in the German there is I believe there's complete transparency.
I'll give way.
No, don't. No,
I mean, you know, yeah. No. I mean, I agree. You know, but Wayne in 2024, just using this without criticism is taking it to another degree. So that was really my point. Anyway, I'll give way to Robert.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. But
I will jump in there real quick. We did find some reviews about the film and the importance of the intertitles. and that some of the reviewers, the French reviewers, were saying that the film is not understandable without the French intertitles, which Claude Farrar had provided. So there was some one of the negative reviews of the film was that it was just what the hell is going on here? You know, like could not follow the narrative without the intertitles. But anyway, let's move on to Robert's question.
Hello.
Which one's Robert? The upper head or the lower head?
Sorry, sorry, he's preoccupied. Just
Hello?
no, he's lost the question. I'm sorry. Well, I'll speak for you. So thank you for the lovely talk. So I am not a film scholar, actually. I am.
That makes two of us.
And three. I mean, I'm not a scholar of any description. I'm just someone who hangs around. So don't worry. Don't apologize.
I by training, I'm a historian and an ethnomusicologist, and so this is mostly a question about music. Which is what kind of music accompanied this production? You said it was 3 films originally that were kind of compressed into one for the German and then kind of passed around willy-nilly, as it were. I am pulling on what little interaction with film scholarship I've had the chance to read, but at this point in time, if I'm not misremembering it completely, not all films had a soundtrack accompanying them, correct? Like there was still live performers that would sometimes perform these films, especially in Japan. It wouldn't be until later in the 30s that I think these would be completely wiped out, taking a lot of musicians' livelihoods with them. So I'm very curious what kind of music accompanied the version of Nippon that aired.
So Adrian, you want to jump in on first? I'm looking for a name here.
What? Yeah, I was going to ask you to do that because I have the same problem. The soundtrack was created
by the friend.
It was created entirely in Berlin. And with all soundtracks, even soundtracks today, they're created with 3 elements. There's dialogue, there's music, and there are sound effects. And so I'm fumbling for a name, but Seki somebody, Sasuke or Sasuse.
No, it was Reiniger and Koch's friend. Didn't he do the soundtrack?
Yeah. No, there was a woman too, I think.
Oh,
who played the
Iris,
instrument.
can you help with the name? I know you've shown interest in her. The guitar. Remember
with the
the woman
guitar.
that
Yeah,
plays the
I
guitar?
remember.
She's strumming the
actually
instrument.
a trained. Yeah, she.
Sasue
Seki.
Hakawa.
No, Yuasa Hatsue.
That's it. Iwasa Hase.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Iwasa
Yeah,
Hase.
Hatsue, and yeah, she came over to study music in Europe and had a torrid love affair with a piano teacher. That's what I remember.
Yeah, that's her.
Exactly. Thank you. So, Robert, building on that excellent information from Iris, there was this torrid relationship with an instrumentalist who appears at the beginning of the Swiss German version as one of those specially created scenes. The score, as Wayne was saying, I think was written by a friend of Lotte Reiniger and performed by the Japanese musician. It was then mixed with sound effects and the students speaking Japanese words to create a single unified form. So much in the 2-part post-war French version is missing. That sequence of somebody strumming an instrument is totally lost today. Whether it was in the 3-part French version, we don't have the records yet to confirm or deny that. So all we can rely on is what survives at the beginning of the Swiss German. So that the technical process of bringing music, sound effects, and dialogue together is a process that started in the very late 20s, early 30s, and ended up today with Dolby Atmos in a slightly more sophisticated manner. But, I don't know, Wayne, if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, so I was just looking up. I believe, and I could be wrong because we haven't really looked too much into the music as element, the soundtrack element. But what was it? Eric White, who was friends with Reiniger and Koch, and I believe he wrote the music for Nippon.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we looked into him quite a bit, quite extensively. And so there was, to kind of go back, Robert, to your question there, but there was a sort of soundtrack made for specifically made for the German version of Nippon. And I believe it was Eric White. The Hasue, her section is only just kind of like maybe a minute and a half shot of her playing this traditional Japanese guitar, and then moving over into the images that Koch creates as sort of an introduction to the film. A map of Japan turning into a sword and things like that. So there was definitely a soundtrack. It was not an orchestra playing with it, as that probably would have been too expensive for that type of production.
Fascinating. Thank you. Was it a biwa that they were strumming in the beginning then? Or
Three string, I want to say
yes,
it's
large pear-shaped body.
It was actually more, I think it was rectangular, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Oh, was it a shamisen then?
Yeah, could be. That might have been her.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find a picture.
See, now I'll have to go find a way to see this film itself.
Good luck.
Right. Okay, say goodbye.
It's complex, and I mean, it's one aspiration that we've kicked around and have had discussions about is that there is so much of a German version, albeit a slightly later one. There's so much of a French version that is, if the two are put together, could you reconstruct at least the 1932 German version? And we would like to restore that and represent it so that people can actually then truly assess what Nippon was when it was first released. And that's an aspiration that we're still looking into. I mean, just on a footnote to the screening in Sacile at the festival, there is a mention to a pianist who accompanied the screening. And I've often pondered, and I've not found anyone who was either in Sacile in 2001 or remembers precisely, but they could have played it as a silent film with a piano accompaniment. And the excitement after Sacile was the fact that sequences of 3 completely lost Japanese films had been discovered. And it was seemed more important to aficionados and cinephiles or Japanese cinema that these 3 silent films had been found in fragment, rather than the fact that this was a creative work with a soundtrack. So if you've come across anyone who was in Sacile and has got a 23-year longevity of memory about the pianist or no pianist, I'd love to know, because it's intriguing whether someone did play a piano and nobody listened to the Japanese students, or it was another story entirely. Anyway.
Ask Marion.
I've discussed it, and I don't think she recalls it. I mean, there wasn't clarity in her response. So, but I mean, if you look at the time frame of Wayne and I beginning our collaboration, it started at the time of COVID. It was the pandemic that was running through the world, and so most of our collaboration was done virtually. I mean, I'm just across Kyushu from Wayne, so it's quite easy. But it was 2022, I think, before I really got back to Europe. But I can ask her again, Roger. You know, I don't doubt her memory, but she didn't have a clear response from my recollection of those exchanges.
Okay. Are there any other final questions? I don't see any more raised hands. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to ask about? I think also, yeah.